Good morning.
Do we push this?
We're just going to get started in one more minute as soon as we get a few more people to come walk in after they have coffee. Very important. Or tea. Well, welcome to the second day of this 13th plenary for the Research Data Alliance. We're very happy to have you. I hope you enjoyed the first day with the opening plenary, and the wonderful speaker, Julia Stovanovich, was, I thought, amazing. I've heard a lot of other people say that as well, and she was thrilled, delighted to be here and to know that this community exists. So thank you for being here. Today, I think we're going to have another great start to the day. Anthony here and Lindsay have been working very hard to help put this wonderful panel together and discuss it. I do have, before they get started, I have one announcement though, and that is Breakout 6, which is after the last one today. The Digital Practices in History and Ethnography session will not happen, unfortunately. The online program is correct, but you need to cross it off of this one. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Lindsay and Anthony. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, welcome and good morning, everybody. So thank you, Leslie, and thank you, RDA, for this opportunity. Again, my name is Lindsay Barberi from the University of Vermont, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this panel on data for sustainable development, opportunities, challenges, and responsibilities. So to give ourselves and maybe our panelists a quick pulse of the room, how many here, please raise your hand if you have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals or maybe know one or two of the goals? Pretty familiar. Okay, so that's most people. Now, also, could you raise your hand again if you actively work in an area where you're really actively addressing the Sustainable Development Goals within your own work? Excellent. So fewer, but still plenty of experts. Thank you. So for those who maybe aren't so familiar, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are 17 global goals with 169 associated targets, which came into effect in January 2015. Following on from the Millennium Development Goals. And these will continue to guide UN policy and funding until 2030. These goals consist of social objectives like Goal 5, gender equality, and environmental objectives like Goal 13, climate action. So it really spans the range, and they were set with the recognition that ending poverty must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, and while tackling climate change and working to preserve our forests and oceans. So progress on these sustainable development goals requires broad collaboration, as you can imagine, within many communities, but especially, and here at RDA we think about data, so especially the global data community. Interoperability of data remains a barrier to collecting, storing, merging, and analyzing data for monitoring SDG metrics effectively. And improving data interoperability may both enhance the monitoring as well as enable and support actions needed to achieve progress towards the SDGs. So to address the barrier of interoperability, the Collaborative on Interoperability was co-convened as an outcome of the UN World Data Forum in January 2017. The Collaborative on Interoperability released a practitioner's guide for joining up data in the development sector in October 2018. And this brings us to now. So achieving interoperable data to advance the SDGs will require best practices, recommendations, technologies, and support of capacity building, all of which is really in direct alignment with many of RDA, our community's ongoing work and upcoming outputs, recommendations, and the work from interest groups and working groups here in this community that you are all actively working on. Which brings us to our panel, and I'm incredibly thankful to be co-facilitating this panel with Anthony, who we all know, especially from yesterday, is really an amazing expert on the RDA community and outputs and adoption that we're bringing forth. So I'll turn it over to Anthony to set up our objectives. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's also a pleasure to be co-facilitating this with you. And thank you to our panelists, and thank you all to be here in the room and to join us in this discussion. It's really a pleasure to have you all here throughout the week, and I hope to interact with you all more. So why are we here and why SDGs? So as the theme of this year's plenary is with data comes responsibility, we really wanted to raise the discussion and the concerns surrounding what responsibility and role the RDA might play in supporting data-driven and data-centric development across the globe and within our own regions. So the objectives here within our panel is to inform the RDA community of the sustainable development goals in general, including their transdisciplinary importance to research, policy, and community development, as well as describe data and information opportunities and challenges within the SDGs related work, and discuss ongoing SDGs activities that align directly with and/or provide windows for opportunity to collaborate with RDA, including some interest group, ongoing working group activities, and those that are in proposal and development, and broadly consider what responsibility RDA may have to support these ongoing activities, both within SDG work and in other organizations that are working within the SDGs. Through our discussion broadly, we'll touch on 4 broad pillars. We'll discuss organizational collaboration, data sharing and interoperability challenges, data sharing and data governance, and capacity building. So we talked about why we're here. Now, who are we joined by today? Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by 4 experts heavily involved in the spaces where data and sustainable development are of key importance. One of our panelists, unfortunately, was unable to be here, and that is Dr. Fasil Fadilima, who unfortunately was unable to travel due to some visa issues. But he contributed heavily to the concepts you'll be hearing about today, and is certainly, we wanted to make sure we represented his contributions throughout. So Dr. Fasil Fadilima is currently the principal investigator for the NIH H3AO BioNet, serving as the major PI for the Sudan node, hosted within the University of Khartoum Center for Biomedical Informatics and Systems Biology. H3A BioNet is a Pan-African bioinformatics network for human hereditary and health in African consortium aimed at developing biomedical informatics capacity in Africa, specifically to enable genomics data analysis by H3A African researchers by serving and supporting education, infrastructure, and pathway analyses throughputs. Dr. Steve McFeely is the head of statistics and information in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, also known as UNCTAD. Steve is also the adjunct professor at the Center for Policy Studies at University College Cork in Ireland and a deputy director of the IASE International Statistical Literacy Program. He is currently a member of the University of London Gender Indicator Advisory Committee. Dr. Devika Madali, who you might know as a member of the Technical Advisory Board within RDA, is also heavily involved in initiatives including UNFAO, UNESCO, OECD, Global Science Forum experts groups on international coordination of data infrastructures, and GSF Co-Data Experts Committee on Business Models for Data Repositories. She's also served as a member of high-level committee evaluating the implementation of open access and data management policies across India. And finally, Tom Morell is an experienced advocate whose expertise lies in the links between digital and data policy, sustainable development, and human rights. Tom founded Data Ready Limited in 2018, focused on organization-centric research and services that surround data governance, management, and regulation and usability. Tom manages the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data's interoperability stream, co-facilitating the collaborative on interoperability together with UNSD and Open Data Watch. I'm very much pleased to be joined by our panelists today. I ask you now to welcome them.
So, as Anthony mentioned, so we'll be, should we do it from down there? That's smart, yes. I'll receive.
No, that's fine. Okay, so Devika, I was wondering if you could maybe start us off in discussing organizational collaboration. As you are a member of the Research Day Alliance as a TAB member, maybe you could have some insights in how we could build potential organizational collaboration.
Okay, thank you, and good morning. And I would like to start by saying thanks to Lindsay and to Anthony and to Leslie for making this happen and having me here. So wearing my various hats on, I'll be talking on and off as TAB, as a researcher, and as a consultant to UN that brings me in connection with SDGs on and off. So I'll be talking in various capacities maybe, but to start off this discussion, the number 17 is what SDG is, but the number 17 is the one which focuses on global partnerships to support and achieve the ambitious targets of what the 2030 agenda is, to bring together national governments, the international community, civil society, private sectors, and all other actors. So that's the kind of a grand vision that's set for the SDGs. But then coming to, again, I tend to, given that I come from, or where I come from, I tend to always raise the flag of developing countries, and that's exactly why I think it's about time. It's about time that this discussion came into RDA, and I really congratulate the organizers here for making this effort, and it's about time we started speaking to these communities, these strategists, which are doing, my concern is we are doing in our own sphere still now. So having said that, coming back to the SDGs, this obviously the goal 17, something like achieving global partnership, can only be done by organizational collaboration, mainly given the diversity that exists in the different approaches, maybe in the infrastructures, the implementations of institutions and organizations, and in the data arena worldwide. So my take is we need a strategic collaboration to convene best thinking around these goals and work towards achieving the goals. Wearing the RDA hat on, and I have to do this because we are a grassroots inclusive approach to data in all its stages of the data life cycle, and focusing on creating the social platform for fostering exchange of views with international research data experts, with the aim of building those social and technical bridges. So there it is. There is the connect between the grand vision of SDGs and the RDA approach that RDA has taken. So I thought that would be a way to kick off the discussions.
So thank you, Devika. So Tom, maybe we can turn to you first. I know both Tom and Steve, you're both relatively new to the RDA space in particular, but Tom, perhaps you could go on with what Devika was saying, especially about collaboration, global collaboration, and especially about the inclusivity piece of that, and maybe speak to the collaborations that you see in your own work.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Devika, for introducing the topic. I want to start with a thank you and an apology. Firstly, thank you very much to Anthony and Lindsay, who have been exceptional hosts and very helpful in organizing this session, and an apology because I'm quite snuffly. I've picked up a cold, so I do apologize in advance for that. In terms of collaboration, I think that is perhaps the point at which the RDA and the SDG framework have quite a lot in common. As we've heard already, the Sustainable Development Goals are designed to be holistic and non-exclusive. They bring together socioeconomic targets and goals, I guess more traditional development, environmental protection objectives, and also objectives around the tackling of inequalities within and between societies. So I think that this holistic approach, an interdisciplinary approach, perhaps, if I can label it that, is where there is a point of synergy with RDA, which I've learned brings together researchers really from across all domains, from the hard sciences to the social sciences and humanities. And I think that there are lessons perhaps there for both those who are involved more practically in development work around the Sustainable Development Goals and those within the RDA community. There are a couple of other reflections I'd like to make, but before I do make those reflections, I will just very briefly go into how I encounter partnerships and collaborations in my day-to-day work, and I'll do that with my Global Partnership for Development Data hat on. So the Global Partnership for Development Data is a partnership of over 300 entities, supported by a secretariat of which I am kind of a part. They They connect organizations, governments, private sector partners, non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, etc., to each other. They catalyze new partnerships and new forms of collaboration, and they convene meetings and events to bring people together and to share knowledge. And this happens across 3 different levels. It happens within countries, and I have colleagues who work across both West and East Africa, who work together with government partners there to convene in-country data collaboratives, which are multi-stakeholder in nature and bring together various different stakeholders who have sectoral interests, whether it be around environmental data or education data, and they come together to develop frameworks and partnerships to meet local data needs there. At the regional level, there are initiatives too. I think perhaps one large initiative which stands out that the Global Partnership has been heavily involved in is the African Regional Data Cube. So this is a partnership between 5 African countries, NASA, the European Space Agency, Strathmore University, Amazon Web Services, and a number of other partners to come together to build a data cube based on satellite imagery over time for the African continent, and that has been a very successful partnership. And while it's still being developed and underway, it's very promising, and there's a lot of excitement about that. Finally, of course, the Global Partnership also operates at the international level, and the collaborative that I manage together with the UN Statistical Division and Open Data Watch falls into that category. I'll be speaking to that in a few moments, so I won't go into detail about that. But at the global level, there are several partnerships and collaborations which are fairly similar. So just to round off my thoughts on partnership, though, I think that partnership and collaboration are fundamental to everything that we do. It's all very well being a sector specialist and the rest of it, but if you can't communicate that to others and make the case as to how your little piece of the jigsaw puzzle helps build the larger picture, I think everything is quite futile and we won't really get anywhere. SDG 17, if I'm not mistaken, is the most underfunded in terms of the targets and the activities there, and I think that that's a shame, because it is the glue that brings all the other ones together. So that's just a thought there, and I think that also reflects, though, the neglect sometimes that partnerships and the role of partnerships and collaboration face in policy circles.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Steve, I want to open it up with a similar question, but maybe with a specific bend, because we have talked a little bit about some of the parallels of the data communities that, that there's sort of the development data community, which really gathers in large conferences like the World Data Forum, for example, which maybe parallels RDA to some extent. And I'm curious if you can talk about global, your partnerships in the work that you do at UNCTAD, but also maybe relate that back to that these 2 different maybe potential parallel worlds and maybe how to bridge them.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you for the invitation to speak. When I was asked to speak, not being used to the RDA, I had a number of questions, and Anthony did his best to answer them, but I said, no, I'd actually like to pose the questions here so you understand, because some of these issues are contested, so it's impossible to come up and speak as if this is all agreed. So first of all, I asked, what did he mean by sustainable development, or even development? Was he talking specifically about Agenda 2030, or was he talking about a broader issue? Because as I said, this is a very contested issue, so even the word development is quite loaded. So depending on what we're talking about measurement, we need to be sure. The second issue is the difference between data and statistics. The thing that's fascinated me since I've come to this conference is I haven't heard the word statistics once. So I asked us, what do you mean by data? Are you talking literally about the pieces of information, or are we talking about aggregate information? Because in the world that I inhabit, generally we're talking about statistics. We're talking about moving aggregate information, and typically we're trying to populate a global indicator framework. And obviously, if you're then talking about moving microdata, or what I would consider data, that's a much more complex proposition in terms of legal and confidentiality. And then thirdly, when you put those 2 things together, when we're talking about data and statistics for development, are we talking about the information that's required to populate the global indicator framework, Or are we talking about the broader issue of the data or statistics that are required to formulate policy and inform policy and assess policy for development, however that would mean? And again, they're two very, very different conversations. And I would argue at the moment, unfortunately, within the kind of the government circles, the UN Global Indicator Framework has rather hijacked the debate. So when we talk about data for UN development or for sustainable development, we tend to be talking about this particular indicator framework of 232 indicators, but we're not talking about the broader issue of the information that's required to formulate policy to actually try and implement or achieve sustainable development. So then, how do we communicate between the two universes? So largely we deal with governments. We partner with other UN agencies, with other international organizations, but primarily with countries. And one of the issues that we've started to discuss at the moment is how to harness, how to move outside the statistical system framework to what's now be called, in our world, data ecosystems. And I guess all you guys, we would bundle into this larger group called data ecosystems. And how do we partner with the people in this room? How do we harness both the information that you've collected, but also the intellectual capacity, the conceptual work that you've been developing for sustainable development and move just beyond the official statistics realm? So I'll stop there for a moment.
So you brought up multiple, we've heard multiple issues about bridging terminology and joining up terminology, and also the issues of bridging organizations to build a strong collaborative. But those same issues of bridging and crosswalking and defining terminology certainly apply to interoperability and the actual issues within the data itself. So Tom, I was wondering if you could maybe speak a bit, as you've been highly involved within the interoperability collaborative, of how these same issues of terminology and how these same issues of crosswalking and bridging terminology come to play within interoperability, and what interoperability actually means within your own spaces.
Thank you very much. That's quite a challenging question, and it took us a long time, even just within the work that I've been doing, to reach consensus, as it were. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, in a few moments we'll probably go into a bit more detail about some of these issues. So just to set the scene here in terms of interoperability itself, I want to share, I guess, 3 insights that I have after spending probably about 4 or 5 years now working specifically on data interoperability for development. That's how exciting my career has been the past few years. So I think within the context of the SDGs specifically, there are perhaps 3 reflections that I have, and three main challenges, as it were. The first is this point still of confusion around what we mean by interoperability. The second is confusion around how to actually balance the data dimensions of the SDGs with the political agenda. I think it's really important to remember that first and foremost, the 2030 Agenda is a political agreement between all countries of the world, and it has a data dimension attached to it in the form of the SDGs. And then thirdly, I think that there is still a failure generally, and I've seen this within this community as well, but you're certainly not alone. There's a failure generally still to frame both prioritization and interoperability within a data management framework, and to think about how to govern data across its life cycle. So to go into a bit more detail perhaps about how that's played out in my work. Just to kick off, I'd like to introduce and explain the collaborative a little bit more, just so that people have an idea. The collaborative for SDG data interoperability was one of the outcomes of the first World Data Forum, which was held in Cape Town, South Africa, back in 2017 now. It's co-convened by the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data and the UN Statistical Division. And I think the beauty of that is that it brings together the 2 large secretariat functions of people involved in data for development globally, with the UNSD being the secretariat for the annual UN Statistical Commission, which is all the chief statisticians of the world meeting together, and the Global Partnership, as I've said, bringing together over 300 entities. So that was quite an important starting point to make sure that we had representatives from both of those constituencies, and that we were able to bring them together to help break down some of those more traditional silos as well, between more traditional statistical data producers and new sources of data, as they're generically called. So within that within that context, there are those three issues that I mentioned: confusion around the term interoperability, confusion around prioritization, and this issue of placing things within a data management context. It took us about 18 months to get to a point where everyone was relatively clear about what we meant by interoperability, because it comes up in so many different ways. And a very useful tool that we used to help do that, and that's reflected in the guide, was to adopt a conceptual framework around interoperability. And we landed on the Berkman Klein Center's data commons model from Harvard University, which basically splits interoperability out into 6 different layers. For all intents and purposes, that can be simplified into 4: human interoperability, institutional interoperability, technological, and data-related. And that framework, I think, really set the scene to help us all get on the same page about what we meant when we were talking about interoperability, because the scale and the range of interoperability challenges that people face varies broadly, from anything from 2 organizational policies not joining up in terms of how to handle particular data sets, all the way down to issues of formats, classifications, and data standards. All of those are interoperability issues, but in very different ways. The second, and this goes to some degree to Steve's point as well, is confusion around prioritization. If you keep in mind what I said about the 2030 agenda being primarily a political agenda, I think that there's 2 approaches which I see predominantly of how countries are approaching the SDGs. On the one hand, there are countries which are trying to make the SDGs work for them. So what I mean by that is they have their own national development strategies, and then they're kind of cherry-picking the bits of the international framework that fit into that, and seeing how they cross over, how they overlap, and what they can do to contribute to global aggregates and comparability of development outcomes. Then there are countries which are still quite confused about how it all fits together, and are slightly obsessed perhaps with wanting to report annually on progress towards the SDGs. And I'm not saying that either approach is right or wrong, they're just 2 different approaches that exist in the world today. But I would say that there's a big risk in the second approach, in that when the political agenda ends in 2030, if all of a sudden there's no replacement, or if the continuing political agenda decides to focus on something completely different, all of these efforts to develop these systems which are SDG specific might have been in vain. So I think it's really important to remember the essence of development, as Steve put it, and to think about what it is we're actually really trying to do, which is to improve livelihoods, protect the environment, and reduce inequalities. And sometimes you do have to take a step back. My final point, and I'll be brief because I'm conscious of time, but my final point here is around prioritization and framing of interoperability. And again, the approach that we've taken within the collaborative, and again, it took us a very long time to land here, but the approach that we've taken is to try and adapt and adopt best practice standards for data management to the development space. So we were heavily influenced by the data management body of knowledge and similar tools and documents which are used primarily in the private sector when developing data management and governance systems. And we've tried to adapt those to the extent that we can and make them relevant and appropriate for development actors. So I think I'll stop there for the time being. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tom. So, Devika, I wanted to turn to you as you've been involved in building a lot of international infrastructure collaboratives, and also you're highly active in a community where interoperability is our bread and butter. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a bit and reflect a bit on interoperability as well.
I would like to underline what Tom said about interoperability, looking at it as in a 2-pronged approach, and not just the technological and data approach that we tend to overdo all the time, but the other approach is that human and institutional interoperability, just before we get to the technological and the data-related issues. Unless we solve the issues at the first approach, we would never be able to achieve this technologically. I've worked with several groups. Here in RDA, I headed the interest group on agricultural data for a few years before I moved on, and there are other domain-based. And there's just within this community, trying to talk to each other and getting interoperable has been a challenge. However, to talk broadly on that, it requires a sharing ethos first, fostered by policies and enabling legal frameworks that are required, which differ in huge proportions and degrees across nations. So this is something that we need to look, especially when we talk about something like SDGs, of which interoperability is one of the factors. And then the other notion that we propose a standard, some standard for something, and then we presume that interoperability is taken care of, is something that we always do. So this just to put a thought into your minds, why does the de facto always rule over the standard? I think there's a thought. So that's my take on interoperability, very desirable, very difficult to get there.
So Steve, we've all been lucky enough to speak with you a bit about the week of some of your real fun challenges of defining outcomes and crosswalking across outcomes and really having the statistical fun of asking someone to define what they actually mean by their outcome. And that obviously is an issue in crosswalking multiple data sets and aggregating data sets. So you certainly have faced the challenges yourself within interoperability. I was wondering if you could also speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so thank you. So one of the things when we're working with countries that we've tried to do is get countries to think of data as an asset and think of data as infrastructure. So when you think about electricity or road transport or any of the things you typically think about when you use the word infrastructure, you think about cars on the road, but you also think about the road. You also think about traffic lights. You think about all of those things. So what we're trying to do is explain to governments when they think about data, it's not just the information, but it's also to think about the transmission of the data, the storage of the data, and the organization of the data. So it's just like any other infrastructure. So it means giving a lot more thought to taxonomies and nomenclatures, classifications, codifications, vocabularies, whatever. And think about how to organize that, particularly administrative data within a state. How to think about organizing those information so that they can talk to each other. In the context of organizing information for development, no country can afford to collect all the information at once from surveys. So it really has to think about harnessing the information that are siloed across government departments or other institutions that are not being utilized. So it's really thinking about the organization of information as a system. And of course, this then raises other issues. It raises legal issues about the safe transmission and access to data, who should have access, to what level of information should they have access, who's allowed to share information, can that information move outside the state, must it remain within the state? It involves confidentiality and anonymization, cybersecurity, and also quality assurance. If you're going to use information from other departments, can you trust that information? Has it been well curated? Or what has it been manipulated for ministerial purposes? So these are all issues that are central to partnerships and communication. And they're different in every country as well. So from the UN perspective, you can't come down and lecture a country about how to do this because there's huge cultural issues at stake as well. And what we find is a lot of these conversations are quite difficult to have with countries because in a lot of cases they don't want to have these conversations. So our challenge really is raising these issues and getting governments to realize that in a data-driven world, and information, as I said, data are assets, and they must start treating them like assets. They must invest in them, and they must take information seriously. And it's something politicians find very, very difficult to do. They want information, they want simple information, so they don't want to hear about complexity, and they certainly don't want to hear that they have to invest. They want it for free. So these are challenging conversations, but I think these are the issues that probably I spend most of my time talking to ministries about.
Great. So you've just really covered the pillar of data sharing and data governance and set that framing really well. And so I wonder if we could turn back to Devika, if you had some thoughts, especially as I was thinking about that, sort of coming back to your sort of call recognition of raising up the conversations around diversity, especially, and power dynamics within these sorts of collaborations, but then thinking about especially the data sharing and data governance aspects of that. I wonder if you could connect to some of those topics.
Yeah, again, wearing my RDA hat, so we do quite a bit of work with the data governance and this thing within the relevant WGs. But they, like I said, already pointed out, there are issues. There are, like Tom already said, that even having conversations started between nations is difficult. And this is exactly why I like the SDG discussion within this group over here, to sort of broaden out the vision to global. And I'll get to term bashing in a minute or so, but, but we use the word global and international off and on, but it means a whole lot of things. And governance and legal frameworks and getting interoperability around those are still an issue that we need to focus on.
And so, Tom, sort of similarly, I know you've had a lot of experience in the sort of legal realms as well. So we talked a little bit about, or Steve raised the point of the governance, sort of opening this up to more of the legal and ethical pieces. But maybe you could speak to those of data sharing. Yeah.
Yes. Well, those who had the misfortune, perhaps, of being in the workshop with me for a couple of days will be sick and tired of hearing me talk about the legal dimensions of data sharing. But it's very complicated, to put it that way. I think from a legal perspective, the sharing of data, as Steve said, is far more complicated than the sharing of information, simply because of the risks attached. And the huge different variety of the types and forms of data that exist. I think there are cross-cutting issues, and the other reason that it's especially difficult is because all the various different parts of law that you have to look at to get a sense of how to best share data come from very different traditions and very different backgrounds. So I'll try and explain that to the best that I can. So obviously you have, fundamentally, the concept of data protection perhaps is perhaps one of the most important dimensions from a legal perspective of data sharing that you have to keep in mind. But data protection law has emerged over time very differently and very separately to the concept of privacy. And this idea of information privacy is relatively new, especially when it relates to the digital space. So there are now, I guess there are trends in some parts of the world to try and bring together data protection and privacy legislation under a broader banner, perhaps, of misuse of information, to give it that name. And in fact, a colleague of mine, I think, came up with that term. So things like the European General Data Protection Regulation, for the first time, to my knowledge certainly, tie together two historically quite different legal regimes of data protection and data privacy. So that's one area, and all of that is still emerging, and the law always follows politics, and politics follow facts. So it's still quite behind current technologies and current trends, as it were. The other thing that always comes up in the context of data sharing is the right to reuse data and information, and how exactly to do that, and what conditions need to be attached, et cetera, and all of that, again, relates to data protection and privacy, and you have all of those compliance dimensions that you have to think about. But then there's a whole load of IP, intellectual property law, that you have to consider there as well, around licensing and the rest of it. I am not traditionally an IP lawyer, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But suffice to say that there are no easy answers to that. The more that I think about all of this, the more I'm convinced that perhaps we're looking at it the wrong way around, and instead of focusing on law and trying to work out legally what we can and can't do, we should take more of a data management approach and work out exactly what it is that we need to do and want to do between our institutions and our organizations, and then work backwards to find a legal language to make that happen. Because often the confusion arises when people are trying to work out what they want to do through a legal framework. And if you're not familiar with the legal framework, you're just going to add to the confusion by doing that. So ignore the law for a moment, work out what it is you want to do, and then work backwards to find out legally what you can and can't do based on that. That would certainly be my approach. I know that's probably not incredibly helpful for all of you who have many questions about what all of this means in practice. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think that is perhaps the most important, those are the most important points to make. The two broader points I would make in terms of what I see in the world that I operate in, that at a very macro level almost are concerning to me, is on the one hand, the emergence of very different and often conflicting privacy and data protection regimes around the world. You know, the geopoliticization of data almost has meant that the North America, Europe, and China certainly have very, very different approaches to how they approach the rights that people can have over their data, and this will inevitably create conflict and difficulty for international data sharing. And I think it's important to recognize that there is a political dimension to that. We can't forget that a huge part of the GDPR, a huge part of the rationale for it is to kind of rein in American large companies dominating European markets in the absence of competition there. And then the second big point that really concerns me, actually, in my day-to-day life, if I'm brutally honest, and I see lots of really innovative, glitzy, sexy projects going on using data all over the world, but you know, how do we actually protect rights in a context where there is no data protection legislation? If I'm not mistaken, I think it's 38 out of 54 African states don't have any data protection laws, and yet we have all of these data for development projects, programs, etc., compiling, collecting, and doing all kinds of things with people's personal data in the absence of any kind of local legal framework. So that really concerns me, and I think it's something that we have an ethical obligation to work towards resolving.
So before we turn to capacity building, I wondered, Steve, did you want to reflect on either of what Devika or Tom raised in the context of data sharing and governance?
No, I just want to come back to one point that Tom made, because I think it's a very important one. As I said, the concept of development is contested, but within the UN space, it's changed. So a couple of years ago, development would have been broadly conceived or defined by the Millennium Development Goals. That's now changed to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a much, much broader concept. And this has left a lot of national statistics offices and international organizations in a quandary what to do about this. So there's a lot of new dimensions now included in development that are far outside the expertise of national statistical offices. And chief statisticians around the world are grappling now with this dilemma of how to provide the information for development for these new dimensions. Do they invest money so that they have a limited budget? Do they invest money in these new indicators which will take time to develop? And the risk in doing that is in 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals are over, that governments may decide to change tack, because naturally global priorities will change. And money that they've invested in developing new statistical systems may then be redundant. So do they do that, or do they invest money, do they kind of, to some extent, ignore the Sustainable Development Goals and invest money in national statistical systems and be kind of more selfish or more nationalistic and prioritize their own national goals and to some extent ignore the global priorities? And the challenge for a lot of countries is aid is tied to this. So in particularly if we want to use the word developing countries, they have less freedom than developed countries because a lot of their resources is tied to aid. So they have less choices than developed countries because of resourcing. And I think this is a huge challenge for the information world generally. So I think it's just interesting to reflect on that because it's a very, very difficult choice that statistical offices and countries will have to make.
So I think this brings up an excellent point of capacity as freedom and capacity as the ability to choose. So capacity can mean multiple things across multiple spaces. Dr. Fasil Fadilima, especially within his work in the Sudan and within the NIH BioNet, has focused a lot on building education platforms and build capacity and knowledge within students and faculty across the African region. And that's certainly something that is critical. But I was wondering if you could each speak within your own spaces of what capacity development means to you and how it aligns with your work. It can be capacity as money, capacity as people. Capacity itself is actually having the data itself, ownership of the data or access to the data. Capacity is infrastructure and technological infrastructure, expertise and knowledge, and finally that last point, which Steve, I think you made so beautifully, of capacity as freedom and capacity as choice within these spaces of development. So maybe Devika, we could begin with you.
Okay. I prefer the term capacity enhancement to capacity building, because gone are the days when colleges used to sit down, make a curriculum, and think that sufficed for a course to earn the required credits and things like that. Now, wham, we are hit in the face by something that comes up like this data, and then all professionals during the data cycles have to just get up to it, just do it. And before you have figured out what's happening and how things are happening, we have gone to the next stop. So it has taken a whole new dimension of away from the traditional thing. And sorry, I'm using a word, knee-jerk. Our reactions may be knee-jerk, and then we come up with some capacity development or building program and training, which transfers to training. And I don't want to take away anything from the very good efforts of organizations worldwide training. It may be the UN, the RDA CoData, and others, are wonderful work being done. But I would like to place this whole capacity enhancement thing into the right perspective of planning in a holistic approach, thinking about identifying the gaps, where we want to be, or whatever that date is, whether it is 2030 or 2065, which one I do not know. But where we want to be and how we get there is the question we need to address through capacity enhancement as we have it now. Luckily, we have very, very, very intelligent and skilled human resources and thought processes towards this. I think it only takes sort of strategic planning and then shepherding the whole efforts towards this. Again, I would like to bring the focus of SDGs in particular here. I think it is something like 17.8 or 9 that particularly focuses on this kind of an effort.
So, Tom, we've been lucky enough to hear you share some knowledge throughout IN2N and throughout this week about having legal knowledge and legal experts as providing some capacity within some of these teams and thinking through issues of data sharing, but also I was wondering if you could speak as well of how that legal piece is crucial within thinking about capacity enhancement and issues here.
Okay, I'll do my best. I mean, I think the starting point is it makes me laugh because the word capacity in law, at least in English law, has very different meaning. And the lack of capacity is basically when, someone is unfortunate enough to be suffering from some form of mental illness and no longer has the capacity to take decisions about what's in their best interest, etc. So working in development for 15 years, I frequently feel like I lack capacity in many respects. But I think it's one of those terms which actually, it's a shame that it's become jargon, because it is jargon, right? Yeah, I spend my life reading through reports and call training, capacity building, et cetera, and they're words that you just skim over. But as soon as you start to unpack it, it is fundamental to the whole development project from a legal perspective or otherwise. This is essentially what the heart of our work is all about, right? If you're working in a development context, it's about building up institutions, building up institutional ability to deal with situations, to take rational data-driven decisions, building up individual staff capacity and their understanding and knowledge, building up educational capacity across the country to sustain that over time and to have those educational programs in place. And one of the very first, I guess, reflections that I had as a young humanitarian worker at the time when I lived in Ethiopia and worked there for 2 years was just how integrated this concept of capacity really is to every dimension of development work, and just how fundamentally difficult it is to build capacity. We always talk about building capacity, but just on a very, very human basic level, one of the first reflections I had in that context, was reading a statistic of just how high the proportion of stunted children were in Ethiopia at the time. And then you start to think about the effect of that stunting upon their cognitive function, their ability over time to take decisions. And that really creates the context for capacity building, because you know, capacity building in that context where people are starting life from a very, very disadvantaged position is very difficult over time. And no matter how much money you invest, unless you look at capacity building activities in conjunction with poverty alleviation, access to services, educational attainment, etc., then I think it's relatively futile. That has nothing to do with the question that Anthony asked me, though, about legal capacity building. Again, though, it's very difficult because we're all undergoing, myself included, this capacity building exercise at the moment of trying to understand how to share data, the legal structures that underpin it, etc. This is collective capacity building, in my view. And the reality is that, as I said earlier, that most laws around the world haven't really caught up with how modern digitized economies work. So this is going to be an issue that we're going to have to collectively build our capacity in over the course of the next 10, 15 years, certainly.
Thank you so much, Tom. So Steve, I was wondering if you could speak a bit to some of your experience in building national statistical offices, potentially, or some of the experiences and challenges you faced in capacity development there, or generally how capacity development has aligned with your experiences, be it data, knowledge, and expertise.
Well, I'll just make a couple of general points. So I work for the United Nations, so we work with countries. So our capacity development programs must be demand-driven. So in other words, countries must request help. It's not for us to go and tell a country what they want. In general, from the statistics side, our focus is to try to develop national statistical systems in a country. And there's a couple of challenges with that. I mean, oftentimes countries will come with quite a narrow project, so that they want something, and the real danger can be sometimes that these are what you might call trophy projects. A country wants to have something because it somehow signifies maturity or development or progress, but they don't actually want the data itself. What they want is to say they have the system so that they can tell other people they have the system. So it's really to try and discuss with countries what they want, but why they want it, and do they really want what they think they want? Because sometimes they haven't put in the foundational steps. So if they put in a project, so for example, I've been working in West Africa on trade systems, but they don't have any business registers. So no matter how good the system we build is, it will never work properly because they haven't put in the foundational pieces to make the data work. So it's to try and work with countries, but at the same time, the challenge for me personally is I'm a European, so I come with a European perspective, and it's how to recognize that there's different cultural perspectives, there's different regional perspectives, and that I don't necessarily know everything. So there's always this tension when we discuss with countries what we think is best, but at the same time recognizing that we don't always know what's best. The other challenge we face is with donors. Donors, like everybody else, that they're taking money from their taxpayers and they need to show results. So like everybody, they want quick wins. They want results that they can say very quickly, we gave money to the UN to develop something in Ghana, and bang, here we have a result. And the challenge is for national statistical systems and the type of work that we want to do, these are long-term projects. You're not going to see the benefits of a project on statistical literacy for maybe 20 years. And it's how to convince a donor to invest in something where there won't be any nice performance metric for a long, long time. And they'll have to go back to their people and explain that, look, you've given tax money and we can't show you any nice results. So again, there's a tension there. And this is what we spend a lot of our time doing, is trying to work with countries, but also with donors, to develop something that has a realistic chance and a sustainable chance of improving the situation, and not just developing quick trophy projects that will give a result but won't really achieve anything in the long term.
Thank you so much, Steve. So I was hoping we could spend a bit of time in closing thinking about, we've talked a lot about human enhancement and regional enhancement and thinking about sharing that knowledge, but this of course comes down to data and technical and infrastructure challenges, and the hope would be we could, I certainly see a lot of alignment with a number of different working group and interest group outputs and activities ongoing, but I was wondering if you could speak to some of your priority technical challenges that you all face in your own work and how those could potentially provide a pathway and a window for collaborating with existing interest groups and working groups. Steve and Tom, you've been here throughout the week and this is your first RDA experience, and in speaking with you, it's certainly opened up a lot of doors, and I was wondering if you could maybe think about what your priorities are currently on the technical challenges. So Devika, I figured we could start with you in closing and move down.
So, as I already said, there is, in my view, there is a lot of overemphasis on the technological implementations, which it needs attention, but at a stage where we can talk about it at the same platform, especially in the context of global communities and the global things, the legacy data, the legacy systems that's already there, and this is something that we have to take. So if these are the final remarks that I may make on the panel itself, I have to emphasize that there is diversity, it's here to stay, and we always tend to treat it as a problem. No, it is not. Diversity is here to stay, and it's beautiful, in my view. It's monotony that bothers me, if at all there is one. So we just need to think about this thing in a practical way. Like, there are already initiatives that we heard about. And my own experience in about 25 plus years, I've been working as an information management and with various capacities. We have come across the technological barriers. So we'll get there once we solve the building the bridges thing, but we need to figure out where to start. So I have heard these, I promised some term bashing, right? So inclusive, developing, development, balance, global, reciprocity, north-south, south-south, and the list goes on and on. We've heard this, and I appreciate that these dialogues exist. But to realize this, we need to get to the technological bridges in the end. So before that, I have a concern that these words are just coming off our lips like that. So that needs to be addressed.
I'd love to agree, but I think the reality is these are the terms of our discourse, really, and the way in which it's framed. But I think it's absolutely right, and the point, I think, to always be self-critical, and it's a point I certainly try to take for myself, and always question and think about the assumptions that we're making within the development space. And I mean, I very closely linked to that, and I've said this to a couple of people this week, but is, in the development space, if you start from the point of striving for perfection, you're always going to fail. I think it's really important that the assumption always has to be that you're starting from an imperfect place, and that's precisely the point of why we do the work that we do. In terms of the technical challenges, as it were, I think that there's two. So with my global partnership hat on and thinking about interoperability in particular, we spent an awful long time putting together this guide for practitioners, and this year I'm hoping that we get the opportunity to start to implement some of that and to work with country partners that we have to see how we can develop in-country interoperability frameworks, whether they be sector-specific or generally across country. There are a couple of countries who are members of the Global Partnership who've expressed an interest, and so we're actively pursuing project plans there. And perhaps in a year or two's time, if I'm invited back to the RDA, there may be something further to show for that. But really getting into the nitty-gritty and implementing those data management approaches that I've been going on about, I think that's a very exciting opportunity for me. Secondly, just more generally, and in the work that I'm doing through my company, Data Ready, more broadly, just thinking about these legal considerations more and more, and developing and building my own knowledge undertaking work with partners to try and really, on the one hand, provide operational guidance for organizations working in development and humanitarian spaces on how they can best approach some of these legal challenges, and on the other hand, just getting a much better understanding myself of what the broader needs are within the sector that I operate in, and what I can do to influence change at that level to help bring them about.
Technical challenges. Yeah. Where to start and where to end? I have a long list. But maybe what I'd like to do is draw a parallel to the keynote yesterday. At the end of the keynote, there was a lady asked, I think maybe the most important question of the whole day for me, which is how to make the users of statistics understand the tool that we're providing to them. So we saw yesterday how inadvertently we can, policymakers can misuse statistics. There's a misplaced trust at times. And I think, so there's a huge issue around statistical literacy, or there's now a term data literacy, which I don't understand, but either way, how do we get policymakers to take the time to educate themselves on the nuances and also the limitations of the tool that we've provided? To me, that's a critical issue, because I think sometimes there's a misplaced faith that what we've done is we've answered all the questions, and it comes back to this idea of data-driven policy, and I don't like this term. I mean, all we do is inform policy, but there's other considerations that are part of a decision. So we're just one piece of the puzzle. And as the world gets more complex, this becomes a bigger issue. And so if we take it right home to the US today, I mean, if you look at the global trade war that's kicked off, this really comes out of a misunderstanding of globalization. And the problem is the term itself, globalization, has evolved. So we use the same word, but globalization now is not the same as globalization 50 years ago. It's a much more complex picture. And now the simple trade statistics that we produce don't really add that much value anymore, because global value chains are so much more complex. So the idea of introducing tariffs on products where the intellectual property is actually held in the US, but the products are made somewhere else, is a colossal own goal. So what we see as policymakers in the US not understanding how the economy today works, and then we see other countries responding. So it's just one example of the tools that we're providing, but the policymakers haven't made the effort to understand. And it's a failure on our part as well, obviously, because if we're not explaining to people what the tools mean, then those tools are useless. So I think for me, that's probably the single biggest challenge, is to make the use of the statistics, but also the health warnings clear, so that people know what it is what they're using.
So thank you all so much. We've heard a number of things from concerns about trust, concerns about data and capacity as freedom, a number of things. Now, we really would love to hear from you all in the audience, if you might have any questions, and then we'll wrap up with some other events that are ongoing throughout the plenary, and some other thoughts surrounding working groups and interest groups that may align. But we'd really love to hear some questions if you might have some. Yeah. Yeah, so there's mics in each aisle, and we have about 10 minutes up. Yeah, okay, so we've got about 5 minutes, so 2 or 3 questions, because we got to run the sessions at 10. Thank you.
Okay, can I start? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. I think this is wonderful. I think I can agree to everything that's been said today. I'm very happy that the SDGs are the topic of this plenary session. I have basically a comment which comes out of my own experience, having tried to work with NGOs on sharing data. And it has been addressed partly, but I think this is also important to remember when we talk about research or data sharing and the people that meet here at RDA. These are not usually the settings where I meet the people that I work with in my research. And my understanding in there is not that there's just not an, an understanding of the importance of sharing the data. It's also considered a competitive advantage not in sharing the data. And since the Sustainable Development Goals is different than many other data, because this is data where you basically target where we need them much more. My kind of the challenge that, and I don't have a solution is how to really get them on board. Now I've talked to funders, governments, ministries who fund these NGOs in many terms, and when I address the question of data sharing there, I get this, there's no money in there in the data management or the preparation. And again, the NGOs say the governments are happy if they just get a report where it's put in the drawer. And I just say, well, where's the data? So I wonder, how we get these kinds of groups incorporated in the activities that we do here, because if we really want to have informed data or policy-driven, I agree with the not evidence-based, but then somehow we need to get them on board until 2030 in order to understand the value of the work they hopefully are doing for obtaining the Sustainable Development Goals.
Anybody excited to take a comment about that?
Go ahead.
Well, I have a thought on this. So, to a large extent, this is about incentives. So, why would I share my data if I think it's a competitive advantage not to? So, within the statistics side, there's a burgeoning debate about how to harness the information or the statistics provided by NGOs, by academics such as yourself. And one argument might be if the UN were to set up a global accreditation system that would actually set standards, and then you could be given let's call it a quality assurance or a badge of honor that these data are robust. This might be an incentive to provide the information to that system, because then you get this gold star, if you want, or this green tick that says, yeah, my information has been validated. Because one of the challenges NGOs face, I think, all the time, or in a lot of cases, can you trust the information? Has it been produced for advocacy purposes? So is there a motive behind the information, or is it being produced just as good quality statistics to inform decision making? So that might be one way to consider trying to incentivize the sharing of information.
I'll be perfectly honest, I don't have a huge amount of experience in the area that was raised, but I do know, what I do know, and having done monitoring and evaluation work for a long time, is that there is a tremendous amount of information and data held within entities working in the development sector, within their monitoring and evaluation systems. I am aware that there are some efforts, certainly within the UN, to open up some of that and to open up data which is stored within the UN development assistance frameworks. So from my knowledge, at least, I think people are increasingly aware of the value. But again, incentives, blockages, priorities, money, all of these are things which get in the way sometimes of realizing that value. But hopefully over time, practices will change.
So we have time for one, maybe two quick questions. So maybe Jane first.
Related to the previous question, there was discussion about developing countries particularly and having to make a choice between do we produce these new statistics for SDG and political agendas. So, related question, there was no discussion about how the knowledge economy or the monetarization of data fits into SDGs, and connected to that, are the SDGs as statistical values not of value to the countries? Was that not part of the creation of them? I don't know. Is there not a longer term value to this than just until 2030? Can countries not use these statistics in policy decisions immediately?
Everybody's looking at me. Yeah. You've hit a nerve with me that this is an issue. So I've got this bugbear about open data. And I think this is where it comes in. So that there's a movement called open data, which is to open public sector data, which I'm all in favor of. When I spoke to Tom, I mean, it was interesting because his argument for open data was because of market failure. To me, it's because people pay tax dollars, so they should be entitled to the information that their tax has purchased. But equally, I would make the same argument now. Increasingly, there's more and more proprietary data that we're actually creating. So that data we haven't purchased through tax dollars, but we've created through free labor. And for me, there's an argument that isn't really been had yet about why is open data only being targeted at public sector information, and why is the public sector getting away scot-free and allowing to hoard our data, my data, and I don't have access to it. And I think the next step will be the monetization of data. So if you look at Google's balance sheet at the moment, you do not see data appearing on the balance sheet. But for sure, the biggest asset they hold is the data. And this is going to raise, I think, big legal issues, but also very interesting economic issues in the future about the value of labor, but also how to monetize an asset that doesn't depreciate and arguably appreciates with time. So it's going to raise all sorts of interesting tax issues. So in the context of SDGs, bizarrely, this issue hasn't come up. But I think it's a time bomb that's waiting to detonate. I think this is a huge issue for the future.
Also, what's the scale of things that we are talking about? 169 targets in 232 indicators. What kind of data we are talking about? That's huge. And then adding to Steve's concerns, in what sectors they lie and how we really leverage them and how much of it is open. So do we really think that all the 232 indicators will be fed into? I think we'll be working much beyond to 2030 at the rate we are going. So.
Quickly, maybe
Very quickly.
last point.
So I think we could certainly do another hour and a half just on that question. But two quick points, well, perhaps three. The first is I also agree with Steve's point. It's not just market failure. I'm not that neoliberal. There's also a human rights point to open data as well, which is also that the publication of publicly held information is part of a duty under disclosure of information and access to information law. But two very, very quick points. In terms of monetization within the development sector, there's an inherent contradiction between private sector approaches to data use and what we should be applying in the development and humanitarian sectors. Private sector generally wants to compile as much information about you, an individual, as possible and keep it for as long as possible and do as much processing and analysis of it as possible. If we were to take a human rights-based approach to data collection and use, there's the principle of data minimization, which is that we should be collecting as little data about people as possible, using it for very specified purposes, and keeping it for as little time as possible. So there's an inherent contradiction there. I would say that European law points the way, very much so, I think, in terms of what a potential empowering dimension of this could be. There are three principles there: individual data sovereignty, data portability, and the right to be forgotten. And when you take those three legal principles which are emerging within European jurisprudence, you can see how an individual can become more empowered over their personal data.
Excellent. So first of all, please join me in thanking our panelists. And as we do shift, I do want to mention really quickly that there will be an interest group joint session on data for sustainable development within RDA, and we're hoping to pull a lot more from specific RDA perspectives. So please join us today at 2:30 in Congress Room B if you're interested in continuing on with these discussions and hopefully grappling with more of the RDA practicalities. And yes, thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, please run.
Thank you. I have to run to an adoption session, but great job.
Go run.
You did very good. Yeah.